Hello. We're live. All right. So we'll get started in about 4 to 5 minutes or so as we wait for people to come in. So excited to stream today. Okay. So this stream is scheduled to last about 30 minutes or so. So I don't want to waste your time. I don't want to waste my time. So I'll just make this as efficient as possible. Oh, hello. You're a world history teacher and a lot of your students are in AP Lang. That's really cool. Yeah. There's a lot of like cross between the histories and the languages. Like I remember I was in APUSH last year at the same time as AP Lang. So a lot of the times the events we learned in US history, I would just use in language and vice versa. They kind of work together. And I'm actually going to post a link to the slides here. So this call to action button should show up. Yeah, there we go. Great. So feel free to fill out the poll down there. And if you want to follow along on the slides, they're linked right here down below. So yeah, I just want to gauge if I have a lot of future AP Lang students. I want to see like basically the outlook before school starts in the next 2 weeks or so. And then we'll get started. Okay, I guess we'll start now. So first of all, this is pre-AP English language. We're hosted obviously on Fiveable, and I think it's really important that you go check out their social media. Their Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube all provide very valuable resources for AP subjects, because next year, or this upcoming school year, they're actually going to be offering support for 19 different subjects, including AP English language and a variety of AP courses. So you should definitely go check them out, not only for their AP course subject, but also because they have some great memes on all of their social media accounts. So I'm Brandon Wu. I'm an incoming senior in Houston, Texas. I participate in a lot of social science and humanities-based events, including debate and mock trial. And I'm thinking about studying economics, international relations, or political science for undergraduate. And I have one future stream planned right now. That's going to be about a week from today, next Saturday at 4 p.m. Central. It's going to be about elections. It's going to be talking about international elections around the world and how us viewers here in the US and where you are, basically how those elections affect us. That should be a pretty cool stream. It's usually really small, so it'll be very individualized, yeah. Okay, so let's talk about AP Lang. So there are a lot of skills that you learn from AP English language because it's the first skill that it's the first English language class or a language AP that a lot of students take, because usually you take AP English language your junior year, and then your senior year you would take AP English literature. So I think the most important skill that you learn from AP Lang is definitely analysis. You learn that summary is death. When you're writing essays, when you're reading things, that you don't want to be summarizing, rather you want to be providing commentary, and you want to be kind of like, you want to look at the text evidence, read between the lines, and then be able to interpret it and show, like, basically analyze. Also, in AP Lang, you'll learn how to write effective essays. You'll learn how to read efficiently, meaning that annotations are no longer just highlighting and underlining. Rather, in AP Lang, you'll learn that annotations mean actually going beyond the text and figuring out how this specific rhetorical device strengthens the author's argument. Moreover, you also learn how to create an argument, build an argument, and make an argument seem more persuasive. That's all covered in the AP Lang year-long course, and it's really beneficial because I think one of the best benefits of AP Lang is that its benefits aren't just in that one class. They're in almost every class that you'll take in high school, even in all of my history classes, US history, in Gov and Econ. I think AP Lang teaches you how to write effectively. And given that almost every AP course has a written portion, I think you learn how to express yourself more articulately and more effectively. Okay, so the AP Lang exam is a little bit different now because it used to be like prior to this year's exam and before, it was still 45% multiple choice and 55% free response, but there have been a little bit of changes to the rubrics on the essays, and there are a few less multiple choice questions. So the AP Lang exam, you have an hour to do 45 questions of multiple choice among 5 passages. And this year in AP Lang, they actually introduced a different type of multiple choice question. They're called composition questions. It's kind of in the course name, AP English Language and Composition, but it's just revising and editing. So those 20 to 22 questions will seem very familiar because they will be really similar to the SAT writing section. There's also 23 to 25 rhetorical analysis questions, and those questions range from a bunch of things like identifying the main idea, figuring out what specific figurative language and its how that figurative language makes their argument more effective. And you're going to be reading and figuring out the analysis. You're going to be reading through a passage, and the multiple choice questions are going to be about the analysis and the commentary that you gain off of the passage, not just what is the main idea. It's more so beyond the passage, the author's use of tone or diction. What does that make the audience feel? It's very, it's not like SAT reading. It's another level above that. And then there's a free response section. It's 55% of your score. There are 3 questions: the synthesis, the rhetorical analysis, and the argument essay. And this entire section is 2 hours and 15 minutes long with a 15-minute reading period typically used for the synthesis section. And there's a 6-point scale for all 3 essays. By the way, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat, or you can ask them in the Ask a Question tab, and I'll get to them as I continue through this presentation. And for the next few slides, I'm actually going to be talking about each of the free response essays, because those are typically what scares new AP Lang students and what is different, because unlike APUSH, WAP, AP Human Geo, these essays are very, very specific. It's not like a DBQ or an LEQ where it's different in that the system of scoring is now the same as the histories, I think, in terms of you have to get this point for your thesis, this point for contextualization. But I think what's different about it is the way you practice, because there aren't as many prompts for the argument essay, just the number of world history DBQs and LEQs. And yes, there was a 9-point scale for the essays, but for the 2020 exam and further, they are now 6 points, because basically College Board's reasoning was that if you got a 6, 7, 8, or 9, you would still get a 5. So they just cut off the top 3 points. And in addition, the old exam essay formats, they were what we call analytic rubrics. So they were whether or not you were convincing the reader, but now the essay rubrics have become holistic, and you'll see what I mean when we go through the next few slides. So Jack asks if I'm a horrible reader, can I improve over the year as I take Lang? I definitely think so, because AP English Language is not just about writing and reading at a basic level. You're going to be reading a bunch of novels, nonfiction books that your AP English Language teacher gives you. And I don't know what you really mean by being a horrible reader, but I think you learn how to become a better reader in AP Lang. You learn how, when you read between the lines and look at the author's main idea, you can figure out how the rhetorical devices they use strengthen their argument. So I think you view reading in a different way. So I guess I would say, yeah, you can improve as you take AP Lang. Okay, so we'll start off with the synthesis essay. So as you can see on the right side, there's an example of a prompt that was released by College Board. It was in 2007. It's basically write an essay that defends, challenges, or qualifies the claim that television had a positive impact on presidential elections. So if I could summarize the synthesis essay in one sentence, it would be that given 6 sources, you have to synthesize 3 sources and support and take a position, basically. And how the new rubrics work is that it's a 6-point rubric. The first point is for a thesis that responds to the prompt. So saying something like, television has had a negative impact on presidential elections. That would give you that point for a thesis. It just has to be defensible, and you have to be making a claim. You can't just restate the prompt. Then you get up to 4 points for evidence and commentary. So to get those 4 points, you have to have evidence from at least 3 of the sources that are relevant to your thesis, not just your argument, but to your specific thesis, and also include well-developed commentary that explicitly and consistently explains the relationship between the evidence and the thesis. So you have to show how source C, for instance, proves how television has had a positive impact or had a negative impact. You have to make that connection. In addition, you get a point for sophistication, and this is a little bit different. It's sort of like I think it's called historical reasoning or some kind of reasoning point on APUSH and WAP. Basically, if you satisfy at least one of these things, you'll get the sophistication point. That includes nuanced consideration of textual evidence in your thesis, so making your thesis a little bit more specific, developing a line of reasoning. You can also situate your thesis in a broader context. This is commonly known as contextualization in APUSH, like most of the history APs. You can also include a concession, a rebuttal, or a refutation. Any of these 3 things will get you the sophistication point. And finally, you can have rhetorical choices that strengthen persuasiveness or having a vivid, persuasive, or convincing prose style. Those will all give you that 1 point for sophistication. And I think it's really important because that you're not just using one phrase to get this point of sophistication. You have to develop it. So for instance, last year, even though I took the exam under the 9-point rubric, I think that I'm making a whole body paragraph that concedes and then refutes the opposing argument. That would get you that point for sophistication. If you just mention it offhandedly that oh, the other side is incorrect when they say that presidential elections, television has had a negative impact. You have to go beyond just a small phrase of concession. You have to actually develop an argument based off of that. Let me know if you have any questions. We'll move on to the rhetorical analysis. This is one of the harder essays that we probably write, at least in my opinion, because it's something you don't really do in English 1 or English 2 or whatever you call your freshman and sophomore English classes. Because what you're doing is you're looking at the text and you're analyzing how the rhetorical choices the author made contributed to the purpose and meaning of the text. So that means their specific diction, their appeal to authority, their appeal to emotion, how that makes their argument more convincing or how it makes their argument more persuasive, makes their audience take action. So the 6-point scale is pretty similar among the 3 essays. It's always 1 point for thesis, 4 points for evidence and commentary, and 1 point for sophistication. The only thing that changes is the way you get those 4 points and the way you get that sophistication point. And obviously the theses are different essay to essay. So on the rhetorical analysis, your thesis has to articulate the rhetorical choices a writer made. You're not making an argument about the prompt, the passage that you're given. What you're doing is you're showing how the author of that passage made rhetorical choices that makes their argument stronger. So I would, for instance, say last year's prompt was from Mahatma Gandhi. So it'd be Gandhi's specific rhetorical choices of appealing to emotion, their specific diction contributed to making their argument more persuasive. That's an example of a thesis that could get you that 1 point. And then for 4 points for evidence and commentary, to get the most amount of points possible, you have to provide text references, so direct quotes or paraphrases. I think using embedded quotes would probably strengthen your evidence and commentary. You also have to have well-developed explicit commentary that consistently explains the relationship between your evidence and your thesis, very similar to the last essay. Then your final point is from sophistication. So your thesis has to have that nuance, like it can have nuanced consideration of textual evidence. It can have that broader context. You can situate it within a time period. You can also include a concession, a rebuttal, a refutation. You can also do the vivid, persuasive prose style, or make rhetorical choices within your own rhetorical analysis that makes your argument about the author's argument more persuasive. It's kind of odd. Like you're making your rhetorical analysis more rhetorical and more effective. You can also recognize and account for contradictions or complexities in the text. So that's pointing out that like Gandhi could have made their argument more persuasive by doing X, Y, and Z. That would get you a point for sophistication. And once again, you only have to get one of the categories. You don't have to get all of them. Okay, and the last essay is the argument essay. So this is where you're writing an essay where you explain your reasoning and create an argument. That means you're using tangible evidence to prove your argument is true. So for instance, this year's argument essay was write about something that you think is overrated. So I talked about how American politics was overrated. I used a variety of different pieces of evidence. So there you can get 1 point for writing a thesis that directly responds to the prompt. So basically you're not restating, you're responding. Also, up to 4 points for evidence and commentary. That means you're providing evidence that's relevant to the thesis, well-developed commentary, and you're explaining the relationship between your specific evidence and the thesis. Just a note on evidence, you do not want to be using any kind of evidence that is based in fiction. So citing the Hunger Games would not be a good move, right? And I would stay away from things like celebrity and pop culture because sometimes those don't have the most direct links. So using things like nonfiction literature or history or current events, these kinds of evidence, I would say, are stronger, and they're probably going to be viewed better by the readers as, quote, more relevant to the thesis. And finally, you can get 1 point for sophistication. That means it's the same thing as earlier, nuanced consideration of text evidence, broader context, concession, rebuttal, refutation. I think those are things that your AP Lang teacher will probably tell you to include anyways when you're writing your first argument essay, but just so you know, those could be valuable points. And I would say, like, while in the past you only had to get a 6 out of 9 on the 3 essays and get about 80% or 70% on the multiple choice to get a 5, I think it's probably going to be a little bit harder given that half of the multiple choice is now composition, so like revising and editing, and the 3 essays are now out of 6. So you should be shooting for a 5 out of 6 on all 3 essays and probably aiming for like an 80, 85% on the multiple choice. So I got a question. I know it depends on the teacher, but generally, does AP Lang require a lot of homework? That's a good question. I'd say it probably, yeah. The answer is that there is some good amount of homework, but what happened in my AP Lang class, at least, is that we wrote the majority of our essays in class. So like we did our timed argument essay, we did our timed rhetorical analysis, our timed synthesis essay, those were all in class. But what we did at home were long like projects about like rhetorical analysis, rhetorical choices. We also did all of our reading at home. So if your teacher assigns books, you're gonna be reading those at home, not in class. For instance, we had In Cold Blood, Amusing Ourselves to Death, Brave New World, and we did like a comparison with 1984. So all of those pieces of literature you'll probably be reading at home. But for the most part, I'd say like compared to other classes like calculus or biology, like the stuff you're doing at home is not necessarily difficult because it's just the stuff you're doing in class, but you're just doing it independently. Good question. Okay. And finally, I'd say the most important part of this stream is study skills and tips, because a lot of people will ask on Reddit, they'll ask on Discord, they'll ask people like me who've taken AP Lang, oh, which prep book should I buy? Should I get Barron's? Should I get 5 Steps to a 5? And I think the answer is that you don't need to buy a prep book at all. Don't spend any money on something that is basically the same thing as what you're doing in class and what you can do for free. So the best way to prepare for AP Lang is participating in class discussions. A lot of AP Lang teachers do Socratic seminars. Those are really helpful because it's based off of a text discussion, but you're like it's very inquiry based and it's very similar to how you would write your argument essay. For instance, I did one about the American dream, and we had a discussion of whether the American dream was accessible for all people, and that was based off of our book Outliers. You also will learn how to analyze rhetorical devices. For instance, my teacher when we looked at our first book, In Cold Blood, she was like, flip to page 22. There's this rhetorical device. Can someone explain why the author used them and how it makes their argument more convincing? By participating in those discussions, by voicing your opinion, and that's like the definition of analysis and commentary. That's exactly how you get those 4 points on that rhetorical analysis essay. In addition, I can't stress this enough, but read the books and novels in class rather than using Schmoop or Spark Notes. I know it's the easy way out. I know it feels easier, but honestly, like by actually reading the book and absorbing the content, reading especially nonfiction books like Amusing Ourselves to Death, Outliers, and these books that like talk about like specific themes, when you read the content rather than looking at a summary, they help you with evidence for the argument essay. And also, make sure that you're practicing your rhetorical analysis. That means you're annotating and analyzing devices, even in your fiction and nonfiction books. Those will be really helpful for you because you'll know how to annotate on that white sheet of paper on AP test day. So knowing, like practicing with your books, practicing with your class, that is the best way to prepare for the AP Lang exam, at least in my opinion. In addition, I think there are a lot of resources out there if you want to practice. There are old FRQs or free response questions for the 3 essays, the synthesis, the rhetorical analysis, and the argument essay. There are prompts all the way back to 1999. So if you add up the years, that's like 20 years of prompts. So you can definitely get started practicing, and there's really no need to buy like practice prompts when they're all available free of charge. Also, you can look at the course exam description, which I abbreviated as CED. Those have some practice multiple choice questions and even include information about like ways, like examples of how to get that thesis point or ways to get that sophistication point. They give you like examples. And finally, use your teacher. Like that's probably the most important resource. For instance, my teacher had access to the AP Classroom, which all AP teachers will have access to next year. Those will have old FRQ and multiple choice practice, which will be extremely valuable for all subjects. So making sure that you're taking the time to actually do that multiple choice and actually learning how to like analyze and practicing, that's really important. If you want to use some unofficial resources, those are also available. Crack AP is an excellent AP source for almost every AP subject. They have practice tests for almost every AP subject, including AP Lang. They have additional free response prompts if for some reason you ran out. There's also the subreddit r/AP students and the AP students Discord. They even have their own dedicated AP Lang channel. So if you have any questions, you can just ask in the Discord. And there are like 20 to 30 students who have all gotten 5s on the AP Lang exam. So you can just go like basically ask students who have gotten a 5 to read your practice essays, help you with like multiple choice, helping you realize why multiple choice answer is the way it is. And these students are really, really collaborative. They're not hostile, and they're really, really nice. I'm one of them. And finally, I think another great resource is Fiveable Plus, because what Fiveable will be doing throughout the year is that we're going to be doing live exam preparation. That means we're going to be talking about multiple choice strategies, how to write each specific essay, giving examples of great like tips and strategies more than what I've done already. In fact, I think one of the great things about AP Lang is that what we can do is like less course review, but more hands-on practice. Because in the histories, you have to learn a lot of fact-based knowledge for the SAQs and for the DBQ, LEQ. Whereas for this, it's just knowledge from your day-to-day life, like things like current events and history for the argument essay, or learning how to analyze rhetorical devices. And finally, the Fiveable Discord is also an excellent resource. There's also an AP Lang channel, I believe, so you can ask any of your questions about AP English language in either of the Discords. So this concludes the end of my presentation. I'll stay for about 4 or 5 more minutes for any questions you have. I'd be happy to answer them. And I think the link to the slides is still down there. It's a green button, and you can click it to access all of these links. So let me know if you have any questions. Is the SAT reading and AP Lang multiple choice similar? I wouldn't say so. I think the SAT reading section is all about evidence-based reading. So like, for instance, on the SAT reading, you'll get questions like, oh, you'll get a question about like what the author is trying to, like where the author says this, and then you have to find like the lines. That's not how AP Lang multiple choice questions work. In fact, I can look up some just for some reference. Because I think after taking the SAT, I went straight into AP Lang, and I thought the questions would be really similar, but they really aren't. And the multiple choice questions, they include things like the effect of italicizing the words is to do what? Or according to lines 23 to 25, the author's primary criticism is what? Like things like that. The multiple choice section is all about your analysis and your interpretation. Like what rhetorical strategy does the author adopt? Those are the kind of questions that you'll see on the AP Lang multiple choice section. But I would say that the SAT writing section will resemble the composition questions on the multiple choice. So SAT writing will be similar to half of the AP Lang multiple choice, which is the composition section, 20 to 22 questions. Right, we have another question here. How should we start preparing before school starts? That's a really good question. I think that there isn't a lot of preparation you have to do for AP Lang. I know some teachers give out summer assignments. A lot of AP Lang teachers stress like reading. I think that would probably be to your benefit. But for AP English language, I think just being familiar with the format of the exam, realizing like the purpose of the argument essay, the rhetorical analysis, and the synthesis essay, that would be really helpful. Because for instance, how my teacher structured her curriculum is that we started off with the rhetorical analysis, we moved into argument, and then we ended with synthesis in January or so. So we spent like 1 or 2 months on each essay. And honestly, like when we started the synthesis essay, I didn't know what it was. Like I just thought it was like a DBQ, which it sort of is, but like knowing the purpose of each essay, maybe reading a few old FRQs, that's probably the best way you can prepare before school starts. And like really like trying to prepare yourself for a lot of reading that you may or may not enjoy, that's also something you can like mentally do that you don't have to like do physically. Great question. I'll end the stream in about 2 minutes if no one has any more questions. Does AP Lang require a lot of novel reading? That's a great question. For me, at least, I think we read almost all nonfiction literature with the exception of Brave New World. But it really depends on the teacher's curriculum. I personally think that the majority of things you'll read will be nonfiction, and I think that's beneficial because, for instance, Amusing Ourselves to Death talks about how television has changed the way we view news. And like on that television prompt that I showed earlier, I'll have to go back to it. This prompt right here about television and elections, like that's literally like, you could just cite Amusing Ourselves to Death throughout that entire thing. Like Outliers talks about the American Dream, which you could probably like mention in your argument essay. So I think, sure, there might be a little bit of novel reading, and that's mainly to see if you can figure out rhetorical devices or like understand that literature. But I think the nonfiction literature is what's going to help you the most. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. This has been a fantastic stream. If you have any other questions, please feel free to ask in our Discord or even ask in the /AP Students subreddit. And does AP Lit have the same format for the multiple choice questions? I don't believe so. I think AP Literature multiple choice is more based off less memorization, and like I can look up some practice multiple choice to see, because I'm going to AP Lit. The questions are more about like inferences, questions like, according to the speaker, the prophet's word of the weapons will probably not be heeded because, so I think that's more like interpretation of the themes of, because AP Lit is a lot about poems and prose, whereas AP Lang is more about reading like nonfiction, like you'll read science articles or articles about like speeches that authors have given, and these are like more traditional literature and you're trying to figure out the message. I think it's a little bit different. All right, thank you so much for coming, everyone. See ya.